Hi there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer. In this video I wanted to talk about the topic of cinematic pads, or textures, in the context of composing your own music. I've been composing professionally for over 10 years, and this video is just an effort to share some of my learnings, some of my commonly used processes, and to give you an insight into how I think about this quite broad topic of creating pads. So first of all, what do I mean by a pad, or a texture? I'm basically talking about elements in the arrangement which have a relatively static nature that often form a background or an atmosphere, creating a kind of wash or a bed of sound that those other elements can kind of sit on top of. And often this has the effect of gelling the mix together, or sometimes it means that I can take something with quite a traditional instrumentation, and by adding a pad or a sound design element, it can feel a bit more contemporary and modern. In terms of what sounds make up this pad or how I'm getting there, the source material, it can really be anything from more traditional sounds like sustained strings, or the source material might be more synthetic or electronic, or synth-based, or it could even be based from like Foley recordings or noise. The term pad or cinematic texture is more about the function that the sounds play in the arrangement rather than exactly what the sounds are materially made up of, if that makes sense. When I was starting out composing, there were two approaches that I would commonly take, which I've actually ended up drifting away from the more I've been involved in creating music. These were just preset flicking through synth-type instruments like Omnisphere or other sort of sample packs that offer cinematic textures just sort of out of the box. Just flicking through presets and going, okay, that one feels like the right ballpark, maybe making a few tweaks and then leaving it at that. The other approach would be basically a more playful or open-ended approach where I open up some kind of synth or I use a hardware synth, and I'm just sort of playing around and fiddling and kind of going down the rabbit hole. You're kind of throwing stuff into like a crazy granular engine or some kind of LFO-based tool, and you're kind of fiddling around with parameters, not quite always knowing what you're going to get, what you're doing, but at some point you're like, oh, I like that, and then you might bounce that to audio and use that as the starting point. That's a more experimental, open-ended approach. Those two approaches are not what this video is about. This video was an attempt to crystallize this slightly more intentional approach, which is one that I find myself more commonly gravitating towards these days. And that's one where I'm thinking more deeply about the specific axes or characteristics of the pad that I want, and then sort of going and getting that in a more intentional way. So what do I mean by these different axes or characteristics? I'm thinking of words like dark and light, volume, including how it might swell moment to moment, but also how it might swell across a larger window of time. Things like pitch, things like the amount of distortion or crunch, things like the amount of movement. I also think a lot in terms of the duality between very complex sounds versus very sparse or spacious sounds. So I'm thinking more at that level, and I'm using whatever tools I have at my disposal to move things, scope into the sound that I want based on my decisions around these kinds of axes. I don't think there's anything wrong with preset hunting or taking this more playful, experimental approach. If that kind of approach works for you, it's really whatever gets you there. So anyway, without further ado, let me just dive straight into some examples of the processes that I would use. So the first and most simple and most common way that I'd approach making a pad is simply to choose a source sound of some kind and then play with filtering it, and specifically do that in a real-time way to shape the sound across the course of the track. Probably the most common source sound that I use is the string flautando patch full ensemble from Spitfire Chamber Strings. On its own it sounds like this. The most common way I'd make this more of a synth pad rather than a string sound is simply by filtering off the top end. And I'm doing that using some controllers on my keyboard. So I can play some notes, hold down the sustain pedal, and then I can shape the sound in real time. So if I just go into latch mode, which I have set to a keyboard shortcut, and we just record some material. and I can evolve the sound so that it doesn't ever quite stay the same. But the evolution of the sound is very much based on my musical intentions. You know, how much movement do I want to give it? How dark do I want the sound to be at this particular moment? And of course I can play different notes. You know, fifths or single notes or octaves are very common when programming pad sounds. If I want to open up the sound, I might add some higher notes and start to sweep up. I usually go quite heavy on the reverb with pad sounds, especially if I'm starting with a more organic sound source like a string sound. I don't actually want it to sound like strings. Currently this is quite a static sound when it comes to the axis that has to do with imaging, stereo imaging. So what I might want to do if I want to add a little bit of side to side subtle movement is, well, there's lots of ways I could do that. That kind of ping-ponging from left to right is quite attention grabbing, so I might not want that all the time. What I might do is, again, engage latch mode and then just bring that effect in at a certain point, especially maybe around a transition point. One of the things that I think about when creating pads and textures is I want it to feel just a little bit unpredictable. I want it to feel like it has a life of its own. Even though the sounds might be quite synthetic, I want it to feel alive. I want it to feel performed. I want it to feel expressive. So bringing in certain effects in a momentary way, as opposed to just kind of slapping them on and it being the same throughout, I find yields a slightly better result for me quite often. So say we add in this Devil Lock from Sound Toys, which is a really nice crunchy distortion. I don't want to be hearing that distortion all the time, but I might want to hear it as the volume increases. You know, I could just automate this knob, which increases both the volume and the amount of distortion. And of course, whether or not you want distortion, again, is very dependent on the vibe of the track. Distortion tends to make things sound a little darker, a little bit more moody. Let me just whiz through some other common source sounds that I might use. Here's a really nice harmonics patch from Sunset Strings. You know, I'm just playing one note there, but there's so much lovely texture, especially if I play the octave above. There's lots of very subtle pitch drift and really nice rosin sounds. So that's a great starting point for a pad as well, especially once you start to add some other effects to it. The minute you just add a filter, it instantly begins to sound like a pad rather than like a string sound. This time let's add one of my favorite plugins, Crystallizer. Just mix that in a little bit. You can hear there's just a little bit of shimmer there. Another preset I like on here is the Hendrilizer. That's actually a reverse delay. And it has a lot of side-to-side movement. Of course, it doesn't have to be string sounds. You could also use flutes. Maybe I want a slightly longer attack. Now, my immediate impression listening to it like this is that it's quite a small and narrow sound, and that might be fine, you know, and we might want to emphasize that narrow quality by EQing it in an extreme way that emphasizes the mid-range. Now that might be enough, and I think that's an important point. You often don't need to do many steps in order to get the sound that you want. Just because the sound is complicated or complex or has a lot of changes or movement doesn't necessarily make it better. It's more about how it just slots in to the track that you're working on. But say we do want to give this a little bit more dimension, obviously we can use reverb. This time maybe let's use an echo boy to create a ping pong delay and just mix that into taste. And again, it's just starting to take us away from sounding like flutes, you know. Now, of course, the flute and the alto flute in this case has a specific range. It's constrained in terms of the pitch. So if you wanted something that's, you know, lower pitches, then there's a lot of ways that you could get there. One simple way would be just to down tune everything in Contact. Let's down tune it by 1 octave. Give it a bit more volume. If I just play with the low pass and high pass again, it starts to give us some really nice low end. Different ways of manipulating the pitch will give you slightly different sounds. One other alternative would be Little Altar Boy, which has a bit more of a characterful way of dropping the pitch or changing the pitch. You can hear when I'm playing thirds here, there's actually quite a lot of artifacts and sort of noise and distortion, even though I don't have the drive function on. It's just the character of the plugin. It's a bit of less of a clean way of manipulating the pitch, and that might be a way of creating interesting sounding texture, you know, that's desirable. This particular sound has quite a lot of vibrato built into it, so let's remove that. So if we want a smoother sound. Sometimes you want something to remain dark, but have these little swells of volume. And other times you want to increase the volume and the frequency range at the same time. So you just open up the filter, and that kind of does both. It's a different sound. So for me, again, using MIDI controllers to manipulate the high pass, low pass, filters, and the volume, those are probably the 3 most important parameters that I like to focus my attention on. And being able to play them in real time just tends to give me the most expressive result, and means that I can kind of ride the sound of the pad in conjunction with the rest of the track as it's playing. Of course, so far we've been using just sample packs as our source material, but you could just as easily record something. Yeah, let's have a go with a cornet. I haven't done this in a while, but I want to prove to you that you don't necessarily have to be a master of the instrument to get a usable sound out of it. I'm not a brass player in any shape or form. See if I can get anything out of it. Alright, let's record that. Apologies to all brass players everywhere. So here's our little chunk of audio. I'm going to use Control E and just quickly turn this into a sample instrument. I'm going to spread it across the range of the instrument. I'm going to play with the envelope and the release. And I'm maybe going to pitch the whole thing down just so it sits nicely where I want to play on the keyboard. Okay, now that's sounding okay, but it doesn't sound particularly rich, so I definitely want to add some effects to it. And I'm going to use CC11 on my controller to just bring it in slowly. I could even use my breath controller at this point. I quite like the breathiness of the sound, and that starts to disappear when you add too much reverb. I might even boost the high end. This is kind of arbitrary because I'm not working in the context of a track, but I think it might be interesting to add some kind of detuning or chorusing sort of effects. Mixing in the dry signal and the wobbled signal, it gives you that kind of slight chorusing effect. Bit more reverb maybe. Endless possibilities. Let's talk about one more basic process to get that kind of core pad sound, a slightly more electronic sound this time. So I have a really nice preset saved in my custom channel strip library that I call Moog Pad. What this is an Omnisphere patch with a really nice but fairly generic or sort of neutral pad sound that's mapped to the controls on my synth over here behind me. So all of that is possible just using the controls on the synth here, which is really nice because it's very fun to kind of play in a tactile way and explore sounds. It's not bogging me down with options. I can very quickly just get to a sound I need, but I would choose this in a context when I know that I want something that's a bit more electronic-y, basically. I would say that one of the things that ties a lot of these different sounds together that I've been demonstrating so far is that they are all quite neutral or on the subtle side, and I would say that that's something that in my mind is one of the characteristics of a good choice when it comes to a pad in your track. More often than not, it's useful to have a sound that doesn't steal the show, that doesn't catch the ear too much, if what you're going for is something that's there to fill out the sound and create background texture. You want a little bit of movement, but not too much. You want a little bit of distortion maybe, but not too much. A little bit of pitch wobble, but not too much. And you're kind of tuning the amount of all of these different axes, pitch, space, dissonance, distortion. You're tuning that all to the needs of your track, first of all, but also to this kind of threshold of, yeah, interesting, but not distracting. And maybe you're also tuning them in a way that's time-based, so you're making them more interesting or more ear-catching at certain moments, and then you're pulling back in others, and you're just creating something that feels really alive, organic, and purposeful in the context of your musical composition. Next, I'd like to talk about the topic of sweetening. So in the first part of the video, we were talking about creating your core pad sound. Now we start to get into this territory of really adding a little bit more interest, a little bit more detail, a little bit more complexity, usually in a momentary sort of way, rather than in a way that's going to be happening throughout. It's like, how can I just take it slightly to the next level, focus it even more, and again, in a very intentional way, in a way that fits with the narrative of your track. Let's take this simple synth pad type sound that in itself is quite generic, but we want to give it a bit more character by adding a sweetener. So now we're going to start thinking about things that we might want to layer that creates an additional complexity to the texture. So for this particular sound, it's already got quite a lot of movement, and it's kind of got an internal rhythm to it, which I don't want to disturb too much. Maybe the way that I'll create a bit of variation or a bit of extra nuance could be by adding a slightly more non-tonal element to the track. Yeah, something like that. So there I was very much trying to create something that matched the performance of what I'd previously captured with the pad. There was this general grow in the energy. Maybe at this point where it gets a little bit more high energy, I could add, something even more interesting or complex. Again, just trying to grow it out of the existing sound world that we're creating. One of the ideas in this is like these little swells. So maybe we could have one swell that just kind of goes off on one a bit. And I just mix something like that in, probably in quite a subtle way. Let's see. So we're just using this secondary layer of something that's more foregroundy. That's probably a bit too much. Yeah, that's nice. So, for context, let's imagine that we have, I don't know, a Rhodes, just improvising this on the spot. Maybe something like that. For example, just so you can hear like what it might sound like if you had some kind of foreground element. Let's put all of this in a stack and we can just bring the volume down a bit. Probably turn this up. Let's listen to that moment again. So in this example, I've used a secondary texture which grows in a way that's coherent with what the main pad sound was doing. And then I've used a kind of a momentary, more high frequency rich swell with some effects to just create a little event that acts as a sweetener to the sound. Here I've got a render from a plugin called Pull Stretch, which is another way of creating your core pad sound, which I really like. This is actually an entire mix of a track that I've just put into this plugin. It's kind of slowed it down and stretched it out in a really extreme way. So just a little shout out to that process, to kind of go back to part one of the video. Instead of like holding down notes or playing notes and recording them in and applying processes, you could also throw a sample into a tool like Pull Stretch. So anyway, I've got that as my basic sound. Now I want to add a sweetener. I want to create some decorative elements that sound like they're, again, growing out of this sound. It sounds like part of the same family of sounds. Kind of thing, like something a bit more granular, a bit more like a cloud or a swarm of sounds. So there are lots of different ways that you could approach this. Might take a tremolo sound, maybe a solo string tremolo. Okay. That's a nice bit of source material. So, you know, one thing we might do is literally just layer something like this in and add a few effects to it. That would be a really simple way to season this basic recipe. You know, that's really simple and effective. Just a little shimmer, you know, a little sweetener. But if we wanted to do something a bit more fruity, we might, I don't know, we might sample that. So let's just bounce that down to audio. So one thing I could do is drop that sample into a contact instrument called Cycles. The idea here is to take our sample and complexify the sound in an interesting way, and create, yeah, more of a sort of a swarm of texture. Bit less pitch drift. At the moment we're having random octaves that are creating that kind of sheep-like bah, which I quite like, but maybe I'd rather be more intentional about how that comes in, so I'm going to remove that. And then just play it myself on the keyboard if I want that upper octave. I'm trying to be as intentional as possible and be as particular as possible about what I want the sound to do, rather than just letting the plugin sort of decide for me. In this case, you know, sometimes it's fun just to mess around and see what you get. Let's add something like that into the mix. I'm slightly overdoing it here. Okay, I like that, but it's just way too much at the moment. So, you know, I usually like to get back to audio, and rather than stay too long inside some of these plugins, because it's easy to get distracted. So the minute I take off all the top end, it blends with the other sound much more easily. And it still creates a nice event or a nice moment of sweetening. You might do something like that, for example. Another way I sometimes think about sweeteners, apart from them being moments where there's a bit more movement and density, they might also be moments where there's a bit more dissonance. So this time I'm going to use the same underlying pad sound as I did in the previous example, but I'm going to find a way to just create a bit more crunch in a harmonic way. To do this, I think I'm going to use a very neutral sound. I quite like this, which is something I got ages ago in a sample pack called Evolve Mutations 2. It's a guitar sound, essentially. And it has a nice crunch when you push it. I really like it because it's a very, again, it's a very simple sound, so I find that I have a lot of use for it in a lot of different kinds of context. And because it's very pure, it means that I can make it feel like it's part of this sound a bit more easily. It blends very well. We're in this kind of sound world, A minor. No, sorry, we're in, it's more of an F major 7 actually. It's more like this. So I'm going to pick a note that conflicts with that harmony, but in a nice way. I think this B could be nice. The minor third might be interesting, although that's quite aggressive. Maybe the 7th, the flat 7th. I'm just thinking about ways to create tension. Let's go with the B to begin with, because that's a note that sounds a bit foreign to this harmonic landscape. So I let the main pad establish, and then oh, I like that. That was very subtle. You might not have even heard it. I'll turn it up a little bit. Or I'll just play it on its own. It sounds like this. Okay, so I'll just play it with the rest of the track. Let's hear what it sounds like at the lower octave. That'll be even more subtle. Yeah, so to me that's the exact same idea. It's introducing a moment or an event that complexifies the sound slightly, and then it drifts back to its original state. So you have this kind of something that establishes, then this kind of slightly foreign element that comes in, and then it sort of reverts back to its natural state. So you have this sense of a kind of flow of movement. But overall, the sound still kind of feels quite stable. Before we finish, let me just round off the video by showing you a track that I'm working on where I'm very much using these sorts of concepts so that you can see it in context in a sort of real-world composing situation. This is a track that I'm working on for a music library. I've got a little bit of reference footage here, and it basically consists of some nice footage of cornfields and birds and things of that nature. It's a sort of floaty, classical-ish sounding track, and I wanted to add some contemporary score type elements, so some pads and some textures as well. So I'll just play a bit of it and you can hear how that's all working. So as you heard, there are various pad-like elements. I'll just play a few of them in isolation. So here we have a render from Pull Stretch, the plugin that I mentioned before, where I'd plugged the whole mix of this track into that plugin and found an appropriate section of it where the harmony felt right. I've EQ'd it in quite an extreme way, and I've added that crystallizer thing, like I was saying before. And that sounds like this. It just fills out the high range really nicely. If I remove it, then you can listen to the track without. And then I add it back in. Without. Back in. Then I've used my classic string flautando patch from Chamber Strings. And I've filtered it, really radically again. Then I've got a sweetener here, so on its own it sounds like this. And there's a bit of distortion in there, and a bit of tremolo. And it's doing just what we were talking about before. It's adding a momentary layer that feels like it's part of this other layer, and it's just creating a moment, like a nice moment that's in conjunction with the music. Here we come. It's on the subtle side, but particularly the introduction of side-to-side panning, I think, is noticeable. And in the context of the track, it sounds like this. The other kind of sweetener that I've got going on here is this patch from Jacob Collier's free contact instrument called Audience Choir. That's a really nice one to use as a pad as well. Again, I've really played with the EQ, and I'm automating the EQ as well, I think. So on its own, it sounds like this. So here's the main pad, which is this flautando patch. And then here's the sweetener. And crucially, where those swells are coming is very much in consideration of the musical structure. You might consider this section of instruments as kind of functioning as a pad. It's obviously filtered string sounds. By the way, all of the string sounds in this track are samples, as you can see. The plan is to re-record them with live instruments, particularly these lead parts. But yeah, you might think of this as functioning as part of the pad, you know, if I play it with these other instruments. It's certainly texture, if not pads, possibly stretching the definition of pads and texture a bit here, but it's just bubbling away there, and actually when everything else is playing you don't really hear it that much. What you're hearing is that main violin part and the piano. You're kind of consciously listening to that, and then these other elements are kind of fading into the background. So that's it, a quick fly through my processes that are associated with creating cinematic sounding pads and textures. I hope that was interesting. It's quite a lot of information, but let me know if you have any questions or comments. Everybody has a slightly different way of doing things. And as I said at the start of the video, I don't have any objection to using more experimental or more playful or more open-ended types of processes. This video was just specifically about being kind of quite intentional about these different axes that I mentioned earlier, and thinking about the pads in this two-part way, where you have your core sound and you have your sweetener. I guess the next level might be to think of the core sound as itself having two components, maybe a core sound and something that's adding a little bit of subtle movement, and then you have the proper sweetener as well. You could probably just keep nesting that concept as much as you want. But anyway, I'm starting to ramble now, so I should probably end the video, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.